of essences and being. A look at the two faces of phenomenology. Knowledge of the essences. The basic goal of phenomenology, for Husserl, is to discover knowledge of the highest kind, or a kind of knowledge that is absolutely certain, free from any possible doubt, and completely objective, free from any form of biases and unproven assumptions. Husserl technically calls this kind of knowledge as knowledge of the essences or of pure phenomena. Husserl believes that this kind of knowledge is attainable only through a rigorous method that is supported by a theory that explains how consciousness relates to the world. The phenomenological reduction. Husserl devises his own method which he calls the phenomenological reduction. The phenomenological reduction comes in three fundamental stages: first, the psychological reduction; second, the transcendental reduction; and third, the eidetic reduction. The goal of psychological reduction is limit the analysis of phenomena to their immanence or mere appearances in consciousness, which means disregarding their possible forms and relations in the external world. This is done by suspending or bracketing judgments about the world as seen in the natural standpoint, referring to the world as we naturally understand it. Husserl also calls this world as the pre-philosophical world, for it is the world that we know prior to the subjection of our beliefs to a philosophical reflection. He calls the last residue of this kind of reduction as the pure phenomena. The transcendental reduction purifies the subject of consciousness by suspending our pre-philosophical or common-sense beliefs about this subject. Husserl refers to the residue of transcendental reduction as the transcendental ego. The eidetic reduction further carries out the reduction done in the psychological and transcendental reductions until one arrives at the point where there is a direct knowledge or intuition, or direct seeing, of the essences. In this reduction, it is the transcendental ego that relates to the phenomena immanent in consciousness, and Husserl believes that it is only in this kind of relationship that the essences will be directly grasped. Psychological reduction reduces the objects of consciousness to their mere appearance in consciousness, resulting in pure phenomena. Transcendental reduction reduces the subject of consciousness to its pure or transcendental form, resulting in the transcendental ego. And eidetic reduction relates the transcendental ego to the pure phenomena to arrive at a direct knowledge of the essences. The general idea is that it is only when both the subject and object of consciousness are pure and free from any contingent features that a direct seeing of the essences, or what comes to the same, a truly certain and objective knowledge, is possible. The intentionality of consciousness. The theory of intentionality is a theory that would explain how it has become possible for consciousness, which exists independently of the world, to be related with the world. The word intentionality refers to the essential feature of consciousness or mental states such as beliefs and desires to be related to some object or events in the world. Husserl famously describes this feature as the phenomenon whereby consciousness is always a consciousness of something. Husserl maintains the common-sense view that the objects of consciousness need not be mental entities. If one is thinking of an idea, then one's object of thinking is something mental. On Husserl's view, what accounts for the intentionality of mental states is some metaphysical entity, which Husserl calls the noema, which directs these mental states towards their objects. An intentional object can be identified by various nemata, but a single noema can only identify a single intentional object. A mental state that is directed at some object necessarily has a noema, though this object does not exist. A mental state does not cease to be intentional once the object it is about happens not to exist, for its being intentional is not due to the existence of the intentional object but to its noema. The meaning of being. Since what is in question is the meaning of being, the being of the inquirer must be involved in the question. And this involvement is one where the being of the inquirer is used as the framework for understanding the meaning of being. Heidegger justifies this approach by arguing that the inquirer, in its very act of questioning the meaning of being, already knows something about being, however vague or incomplete. The inquirer already has a pre-ontological understanding of being, that is, an understanding of being prior to a formal investigation of being. Another, since the meaning of being is a question for this entity, then there must be something at stake in its being in asking the question. Heidegger uses the term Dasein, which literally means being there. His use of the term Dasein is intended to highlight his preferred approach in studying the being of man, which focuses on its modes of being, or the who of Dasein. The investigation of the meaning of being has to start with the investigation of the being of Dasein in terms of its who, which Heidegger calls as the existential analytic of Dasein. and the method deemed appropriate for this kind of investigation is phenomenology. Heidegger's phenomenological method is one that harks back to the etymological meanings of the words comprising the word phenomenology, namely phenomenon and logos. According to Heidegger, in their original meanings in Greek, phenomenon signifies that which shows itself in itself, while logos signifies discourse or to make manifest what one is talking about in one's discourse. Together, phenomenology therefore means to make manifest that which shows itself in itself. Its goal is to pave the way for the revelation of being in its pure form. The concrete application of this method for the existential analytic of Dasein is the examination of Dasein's being in the world from the perspective of Dasein's average everydayness, which refers to the everyday normal life of Dasein. Two fundamental things constitute Dasein's mode of existence: that it exists in a world and that it has a self that it defines as it exists in such world. Dasein does not just exist in a vacuum, for there is always context, a world, in which it exists. Dasein is necessarily a being in the world, and Dasein does not just exist in a world as a nobody, for it has a self which sets it apart from the rest of such world, which enables Dasein to have a sense of ownership over its existence. Temporality of Dasein. Dasein's being in or existence in the world is essentially characterized by the presence of involvement, engagement, or Sorge, which is generally translated as care. Heidegger distinguishes between two general types of Dasein's involvement in the world, namely, the kind of involvement that Dasein has with entities it is just alongside and the kind of involvement that Dasein has with entities it is with. In being alongside entities, Dasein involvement is primarily characterized by utility, in which Dasein relates to these entities merely as equipment or as things which Dasein can use, originally for practical purposes but later on for theoretical contemplation as well. On the other hand, in being with entities, Dasein relates to these entities with considerateness and forbearance, which are best manifested on moments when Dasein empathizes with its fellow Daseins. Heidegger refers to the kind of involvement that is primarily characterized by utility as concern, and the totality of entities that form Dasein's objects of concern as Dasein's equipmental world, while he refers to the kind of involvement that is primarily characterized by considerateness and forbearance as solicitude, and the totality of entities that form Dasein's objects of solicitude as Dasein's public world. An essential feature of Dasein's existence in the world is its temporality, which refers to the fact that such existence is always in time, or that it always has the dimension of being in the past, present, and future. In human temporality, the present, past, and future are regarded as forming a unity in that the past and the future are parts of the present, and consequently, reality as here defined in terms of such past is called as facticity, which refers to everything about the existence of Dasein that it can no longer change. This includes all the givens that Dasein finds itself as already having the moment it becomes conscious of its own existence, such as the fact that it already exists, its given physical features, its genes, its parents, the historical period it was born into, as well as its past experiences and decisions. Since these givens were acquired by Dasein without being consulted or without having to decide on them, facticity is described as the phenomenon wherein Dasein is thrown into the world. Dasein's future is called as existentiality, which refers to all possibilities that Dasein possesses and can possess that are yet to be actualized, and which Dasein can still change. Dasein's present is called as fallenness, which refers to the state in which Dasein lives an inauthentic existence. Most Daseins are in such state for the most part of their existence. And the idea here is that while Dasein is in the state of fallenness, it need not be so, for there is something Dasein can do to change the situation, to transform its inauthentic existence into an authentic one. The self refers to Dasein's sense of who it is as distinct from everything else in the world and amidst the changes that Dasein undergoes, and which enables Dasein to appropriate or own its existence. The basic existential feature of the self is its ownership. For oneself to be truly one's own, he or she should be the be one to define it or should be in control of it. If Dasein's self is truly its own, Heidegger calls this self as authentic self and regards Dasein as living an authentic existence, while if Dasein's self is not truly its own, Heidegger calls it an inauthentic self and regards Dasein as living an inauthentic existence. Authenticity and inauthenticity therefore are the two basic modes that the self can assume as it engages with the world. Heidegger discusses three manifestations of inauthenticity, namely, idle talk, curiosity and ambiguity. Idle talks is superficial and boundless communication. It is a form of communication that follows the route of gossiping and passing the word along. Curiosity is a way of seeing and knowing things whose real purpose is not to gain some understanding or knowledge but to be engaged simply in the activity of seeing and knowing. Ambiguity refers to the impossibility of distinguishing between sincerity and insincerity, or between truth or pretension, in what Dasein says or does. If idle talk is talking for the sake of talking, curiosity is seeing and knowing for the sake of seeing and knowing. Ambiguity is the natural result of idle talk and curiosity. When something is talked about in the manner done in idle talk, it becomes impossible to distinguish whether that something is talked about with sincerity or not. Likewise, when something is known in the manner done in curiosity, it becomes impossible to know. Death and the possibility of authenticity. Heidegger identifies 5 existential features of death, namely, its being, one's own most, non-relational, not to be outstripped, certain, and indefinite. It is Dasein's own most possibility in that Dasein cannot relegate its own death to anybody, or that nobody else but Dasein can face its own death. It is not to be outstripped in that the possibility of death cannot be taken away from Dasein, which means that Dasein cannot choose not to die or not to have death as one of its possibilities. This is what makes death a thrown possibility. Death is Dasein's non-relational possibility in that in meeting its own death Dasein cannot be with somebody else. Dasein has no choice but to face its own death alone. This feature of death makes Dasein aware of its individuality or its independence from the world with which it is involved. Death individualizes Dasein, as Heidegger puts it. By being certain, it simply means that death is a possibility that will surely actualize, whether Dasein likes it or not. It is unlike other possibilities of Dasein which may or may not actualize, either as a matter of choice or not. On the other hand, the possibility of death is indefinite in the sense that it is not certain when it will come. While Dasein is certain about the fact that it will someday die, it is however not certain about when that someday will be. Death, therefore, is something impending, and what this means strictly is that death can happen at any moment. Dasein covers up or flees away from the indefinite certainty of its own death in a variety of ways. The first is when Dasein simply makes ways to prevent its consciousness from focusing on the possibility of its own death, often by making itself busy with certain things by engaging in idle talk and curiosity. The second is when Dasein undermines the significance of death in its life as when it regards death as just one of those things that it normally reads in the paper or hears from the news. The third is when Dasein confers some form of definiteness upon death. Saying that death has nothing to do with us right now is a way of concealing the fact that death can happen at any moment. Another way of conferring definiteness upon death is when one intends to bring about his or her own death by committing suicide. As ways of covering up or fleeing away from the indefinite certainty of death, they prevent Dasein from experiencing the non-relational feature of death and consequently what it can reveal to Dasein concerning the quality of its existence. The non-relational feature is what brings into the awareness of Dasein that while it exists with the they, it need not live its life according to the standards or dictates of the they. In short, the non-relational feature makes Dasein aware of its independence from the they. Authenticity becomes as a possibility for Dasein only after Dasein has achieved such awareness. Dasein could only begin to liberate itself from the control of the they and thus define it according to its own terms only after realizing that it is capable of doing so. But to get to that realization, Dasein must first directly face the indefinite certainty of its own death. Heidegger elaborates that together with the realization that Dasein has the capacity for authenticity is the further realization that Dasein has been living an inauthentic life for the most part of its life. And the result of this further realization is a sense of loss and eventually a resolution to make up for that loss by this time owning its choices or by choosing to make its own choices. This choosing to make one's choices one's own, called as resoluteness, is actually a decision to make one's existence authentic. Conclusion. Husserl and Heidegger both say that phenomenology, as a philosophical method of investigation, strives to go back to the very foundations or roots of things or whatever it is under investigation. But with regard to what constitutes the things themselves and the proper method by means of which one can arrive at the things themselves, Heidegger radically departs from Husserl. For Husserl, things themselves are the essences, which cannot be found in the everyday world of man but which can be directly grasped using a method called the phenomenological reduction which brackets the contingent features of consciousness and its objects. In contrast, the things themselves for Heidegger is being, which manifests itself in the everyday world of man or Dasein. And the proper method for Heidegger is the existential analytic of Dasein, where one examines the various modes of being of Dasein in the context of its average everydayness. Consequently, this method will pave the way for the revelation of being.